You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
This is the sound of a protest in mainland China, but this is not happening on the streets of Beijing. This is not a protest about democracy or human rights. It is not a protest about environmental disaster or corruption. This is about money. These people are shouting, "Where is our money?" and "Give us our money back." And they are doing it in Shenzhen, in the foyer of the headquarters of Evergrande, one of the biggest property companies in mainland China. But Chinese investors in Shenzhen are not the only people wanting their money back. Welcome to the latest edition of Inside China. My name is Mimi Lau. Welcome to a week where Chinese investors, subcontractors, home buyers, and banks find they have much in common with banks and investors from the West, as they all ask the same question as those people in Shenzhen. It is a question that right now is worth about $300 billion. Where is my money? And on top of that, some much bigger questions for the global economy. Is Evergrande too big to fail? And what happens if it does? This will be a very different kind of Inside China podcast that you are used to. It is different because as I am recording this introduction, I don't know how this is going to end. Right now, it is Wednesday. It is a public holiday in Hong Kong for the Mid-Autumn Festival. This means the Hong Kong Stock Exchange is closed, which is only helping to build attention because for the past few days, the global media narrative has sounded something like this.
China could be seeing its Lehman Brothers moment, a crisis deepening for its second largest developer.
Investors were apprehensive that history was about to repeat itself.
Also, real estate is such a powerful component in the Chinese economy. It's 15 to 20% of GDP, which is massive.
The company has huge implications for China's overall economy.
Property developers shook investors across Asia and Europe.
If Evergrande isn't too big to fail, what happens next?
Is this China's Lehman Brothers moment? Will this lead to the kind of global economic meltdown that happened back in September of 2008? Or will the Beijing central government step in and somehow fix this? Right now, no one quite knows, and it's only Wednesday. By the end of this podcast, we're going to have a much better idea. But before we hear from my colleagues here at the South China Morning Post, let me give you an idea just how big Evergrande is and how much debt it owes to companies across China and around the world. Evergrande's core business is buying land, then building apartment towers, millions of flats in newly constructed high-rises in more than 200 cities across China. They sell these apartments in advance and then build the towers. For the past 20 years, the company has made huge profits as the Chinese real estate market got more and more intense. A growing middle class wanting to move into Chinese cities has fueled a red-hot demand for new housing. Evergrande's business model has attracted huge investment from banks across China, as well as many banks and financial institutions from the Western world. But this business model hasn't just hit a perfect storm. It has slammed into a Titanic-sized iceberg. Right now, there are hundreds of unfinished apartment towers across China. There are hundreds of thousands of people who bought those flats, wondering what will happen to their money and their dreams of owning a home. There are the companies that are contracted to work on everything from the foundations to the rooftops of these towers and everything in between. There are more than 250 banks and financial institutions waiting to find out how much money they are going to lose on Evergrande. And there is $21 billion owed to foreign investment firms and banks. And let's not forget, there is more than 120,000 Evergrande employees and many more subcontractors wanting to know if they are going to get paid and if they have a job. So let's start with how Evergrande got here with my colleague, Pearl Liu. So Pearl, you've been covering the Evergrande story for the past 2 years. Can you give us some background to this? How did one of China's largest property developers get to its current crisis now?
Yes, I've been covering China property and Evergrande ever since 2019. There's signs showing the housing market has turned sour under Beijing's control since 2018, actually. And we've seen that Evergrande reported its first core profit decline in 2019 for the first time since 2016. So that's the first sign. And after that, the company rushed to diversify its business and burned billions of dollars in making electric cars.
Take us to the story that you wrote in 2019. What was the first sign you picked up?
The decline was after Beijing staged a slew of cooling measures.
When you say cooling measures, what was it that the Beijing government did to try and stop this housing bubble?
Ever since 2018, Beijing has staged a lot of cooling measures, including price cap and limiting the sales procedures. But I think the most important one is last year in August when Beijing staged the so-called 3 red lines, basically choked the developers and dried up their funding access.
Pearl, when you said 3 red line just then, it sounds like one of those Chinese communist propaganda slogan. What does that really mean? Can you unpack that for us?
So the 3 red lines is a requirement on their leveraging ratios. There are 3 requirements on their debts. First is their debts to asset ratio must be capped at 70%, and its net debt to equity ratio must be capped at 100%, and its short-term borrowings should not be larger than their cash reserves. So if a developer fails to meet these red lines, in theory, it cannot get new loans from the banks.
Which were these 3 red lines that Evergrande broke?
Actually, Evergrande has crossed all 3, which make it a red tag. And in theory, it cannot borrow new loans from Chinese banks. It cannot borrow new loans, but it can still get loans to repay the old ones.
The story has developed tremendously the last few months, and it hit world headlines with the protest at Evergrande head office last week. But can you take us through some of the key developments in this story over the past few months?
Actually, early in June, there are already some contractors and suppliers of Evergrande already starting sending messages on Weibo about Evergrande owning their monies and not paying their IOUs. One of the contractor I talked to in June in Jiangsu, he told me that Evergrande has already had 5 million not paying him for months. And back then, when we talked to analysts, they were still thinking probably it is because Evergrande would like to do the deleveraging thing and would like to cut that. But in July, after Evergrande reported some of its improvings in debts, some of its figures turning good, there is a really big moment when a bank in Jiangsu filed to court to freeze Evergrande's assets. This is a signal telling the market that the banks are not trusting the company. That's when the panic started to spread.
So when you said in July, anxiety started to take off and spread across the country after what that Jiangsu bank did, what have you been hearing from your sources and analysts? What are they saying?
So after that happened, there are sayings about even though Evergrande is improving its debt figures, it's not paying banks and contractors that Beijing cares a lot. That's why there are so many noises from banks and from onshore financial institutions. After that, Evergrande has been actively trying to sell its assets, but so far it makes no material progress. That is how Evergrande described it in its interim report. And all of a sudden, there were protests broke out across the country against the company's wealth management product, saying that the company is not paying them on time.
So that's in September. That's when the protests broke out across the country after a series of moves launched by the Evergrande to sell this asset, but it's not making material progress. And then people are starting not receiving their financial returns from the wealth management investment packages. That's when people start to get angry and panic and start protesting across the country to Evergrande's head offices.
Yes, that's how panic spread from equity market and bond market to mass market across China.
So there are a lot of videos going online portraying the Evergrande head office protests in Shenzhen, but we know it's more than that. Can you describe to us how widespread, how angry people are, and how intense are these protests really are?
They're not just protests in Shenzhen. There are also protests in Chongqing, in Jiangxi, and in Shandong. So people were crying. They were shouting, asking why their hard-earned money were not getting paid. And for many people, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million are their lifelong earnings.
Fearing that will all be vanished in a second.
Yes.
So we just covered angry buyers of Evergrande's wealth management products not getting paid for their returns. And we also talked about how the banks are not trusting Evergrande for giving new loans. Also talked about construction contractors are not getting the money back. You have also spoken to some house buyers, people who bought Evergrande properties, and they are angry too. Why is that?
They're angry because they're worrying whether they can receive their homes that already paid down payments that could amount to $45,000 and that could be more than that. They're worried because they are seeing that those unfinished towers are suspended and no one was working there.
You can just imagine how hauntingly scary for these people when they looked at these empty buildings, concrete buildings, great walls, piling up one after each other, and nothing is being done by it. Where do we go from here?
So Evergrande has 2 big deadlines in the coming 2 weeks. Tomorrow it has for interest payment for US dollar bond. And next week, also the interest for US dollar bond.
So if Evergrande doesn't come up with that kind of money by deadline, what's going to happen?
So there will be defaults. It's Evergrande's first default.
So it sounds like the biggest concern is that how the Chinese central government is going to intervene and step in to resolve or not resolve this crisis for Evergrande.
Yes, that is the biggest question, whether Beijing will step in and to what extent.
So what are your sources telling you?
So, Mimi, I talked to everyone from equity analysts to fixed income analysts to economists, industry observers, just everyone. No one has a clue. No one knows what is going to happen.
We just heard Pearl Liu talk about Evergrande's deadline for Thursday. Well, it is Thursday now, and they are supposed to pay $120 million in interest payment by today. But so far, they've only paid a portion of it. I can tell you that there is a lot of tension at the business desk here in the newsroom, and I'm sure the same is happening in the global financial market. Remember, you will get the latest development as they happen on SCMP.com, and if you've downloaded the SCMP app on your phone, you'll get a news alert for it. But I want to talk about one question we have heard repeatedly this last week. Is this China's Lehman Brothers moment? Technically, it's more of a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac moment about financial liquidity. But let me recap about this reference this media framing is about. It's referring to the collapse of the U.S. investment bank Lehman Brothers. Back in 2008, their bankruptcy sent shockwaves through America and the world, and led to the worst financial crisis in recent history. What some people now refer as the GFC, the global financial crisis. World headlines are suggesting Evergrande might do the same to China and the global economy. But is this accurate? Let's hear more about this from Zhou Xin. Zhou Xin is a news editor at the South China Morning Post and one of the regulars on the China Geopolitics podcast. But he has been watching closely the development of China macroeconomics. And Evergrande is one of those stories you have been paying a lot of attention to. So can I just start with this really blunt question, Zhou Xin? Is this China's Lehman Brothers moment as those Western media has portrayed?
Thank you, Mimi. That's a question that is oversimplified the situation. And in terms of whether China Evergrande will start a financial crisis, will the whole meltdown of Chinese banking system, the answer is no. But certainly the implications could be much deeper and profound, and we cannot underestimate the significance of this saga. And I think, yes, in terms of influence and impact, it will have huge and long-term influence, just as the fall of Lehman Brothers has been on the financial system in the Wall Street. So in very simple terms, let's say China Evergrande is a product of China's growth model in the last 20 or even 30 years. As we all know, former Premier Zhou Xin started this privatization of China's property market in later 1990s. And then China Evergrande was created 25 years ago. The growth of China Evergrande fits nicely into China's booming kind of private property market. And this is actually a secret of China's growth. Overnight, lands that have been laying there for thousands of years suddenly become property, become assets. It is companies like China Evergrande that is at the nexus of China's high-speed growth. And it relates to the local Chinese government, because local Chinese government suddenly finds okay, we are actually sitting on lots of money, that's the land. Let's sell the land to the property developers, and so that we have the money, we can build up roads and a more central business district and completely changed China's urban landscape in a very short span of period of time. And at the same time, on the end, it's millions of Chinese households. Used to they live in flats assigned by the government. If you work for the Chinese government, if you work for the state-owned enterprise, you don't pay your own money to buy a flat. It's always it's something being given by the Chinese government. But now with this market, everyone just go into the property market and buy their own. I think the ownership of houses in Chinese cities is almost 80%.
90%.
90%, oh my goodness. And then, of course, the money is not totally from the house savings. Maybe at the very beginning, it's mostly the savings, but increasingly it's mortgages. So it's money from the banks. So it's very interesting. The land, the money, the people all combined together. So it's a China Evergrande that is playing this role. Let's do not use the word that China's unique way of capitalism development. But to some extent, yes, it is using the corporate way to capitalize the land and the money and the households' very basic demand of housing.
Thank you for the answer, Zhou Xin. So it sounds like the growth of Evergrande is closely linked to many important fragments, including economic growth of local city government, the livelihood of many house owners in China, and also vital to China's financial system. So how is this being a test for Xi Jinping trying to put a control of this ever-growing housing bubble in China?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, Mimi, if you pay attention, even 6 years ago, there's a front page kind of editorial on People's Daily. It's by an authoritative figure. That figure has never been identified, but there are lots of gossips that it's coming from Liu He, the top economic aide for President Xi. So in that article, it's mentioned very, very clearly that, the trees cannot grow as high as into the sky, which means the debt cannot always go for forever, and the housing prices cannot go forever. So from that article, and later we coming from this China's famous policy saying the houses are for people to live in, not to speculate on. Apparently, they want to try to say this is some kind of public goods. It's not a financial investment products, at least on a nationwide level. But however, it's easy to say than to be done, because the property price, so much has already been developed and so much being at stake. As you just mentioned, China's banking system, Chinese local governments, Chinese households, there is no clear alternative for this property development. Imagine if the local government suddenly lost the land revenues, and there are no alternative tax revenues or income sources to replace that. And if Chinese households say the house price has fallen down, And some people will be on a kind of negative assets. They own banks, lots of mortgages, and the actual market value of their property cannot cover the cost. It would be a huge impact on the household balance sheet. And to be honest, at the moment, I think, if you have the money, if you put it into the banks, there will be inflation. Your losses will be just to be getting less and less every year. If you put in the stock markets, it's too risky. So housing market remains a primary investment for Chinese households. According to some of the surveys, I think housing accounted for like 70 to 80% of all Chinese household wealth in the country. So it's very difficult. And even for the banking, of course, the Chinese central bank or the banking regulators in the last almost like 10 years is trying to tell the banks, control your exposure to the property. Do not lend directly to the property developers. If this is a home buyer, look at him, whether he's a first-time buyer, really need the house to get married and have a kid, or he is more of an investor. If it's a second house, then raise the rate, raise the mortgage deposit. But there's no way to control this. Money can keep flowing to the property market because for the banks, it's relatively easy. If you lend the money to the property market, there are at least some collaterals. There are some houses that is visible. If you lend it to a small business, the guy's business doesn't go very well, and the bank will take lots of losses. So, for the local government perspective, from the Chinese households perspective, and then from the banking perspective, this property is a tough, very, very tough issue to handle. And now the government, it seems, it's really a test for the government how determined you are. You're willing to solve this problem. And China Evergrande is a very, very good case to test the resolve of the Chinese government. Are you going to really seriously let it go down? If you are a property investor, if you buy into it, it's an investment decision. You made the wrong decision. You take the losses. Or if you're the bank, you lend so much money into that single property developer, it's your own problem. So you have to show the losses. And this, for the local government, say, there's a land revenue will no longer be a permanent source of your revenues. Find a better way to grow the local economy so that your fiscal situation can be more sustainable. Can China really do all these things? It's all open questions. So it's very interesting to see what the government will do in the coming weeks or months.
Can I ask you, Zhou Xin, how did China allow the debt size of Evergrande to get this big without finding out there's a problem? Was it a fragmented regulatory system that leave things slide during these years?
Well, I think China Evergrande is basically exhausting all the channels to borrow money. And if you look at the balance sheet, on the balance is, by the end of June, it's almost like $300 billion, which is 2.95 trillion yuan. That's already a mind-boggling figure. And then off the balance, there's another estimate, according to Caixin, there could be close to 1 trillion or even more than that. So this is almost like 3% of China's GDP. That's a huge state number. So everyone is asking the question, how can one single company accumulate so much debt? And I think the model is very clear. It is a debt-financed development model. And China Evergrande has played it to extreme. For instance, it will borrow the money to get the land, and then based upon this land, it will start to build up projects, and again use these projects to accumulate debt. And then it also take money from the potential home buyers. So another layer of debt. So for China Evergrande, the debt level is it's not from one single source or one single layer. It's almost like borrowing from every stakeholder. According to latest reports, it has even some debt owed to the local governments because it didn't clear all the land purchase bills from the suppliers, from the banks, from the home buyers. Yes, you're right. It seems like the regulators not doing a very good job in spotting this problem. And also, last month, the PBOC, the Chinese Central Bank, and the Chinese Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission summoned China Evergrande for talking, say you have to pay attention to your risks. I think it's a little bit late. I mean, this kind of talking should happen way before then, China Evergrande started to show signs of trouble.
So, there have been whistleblowers over the years suggesting Evergrande's solvency crisis or signs of that. How do these noises get ignored?
As long as the property prices keep rising, these shouldn't be a problem. The party can go can go on as long as the prices are not falling down. So it's the same kind of household metaphor. For instance, you own a house and you borrow lots of money, but if if your apartment, if your flat, the value is increased by like 30%, you can find it very easily to cover your debt. But however, the problem will emerge when, the price stopped rising. So every dollar in the debt are real, like you own the bank wants the 4 months of money to back. But your assets is actually inflated. You can't find the buyer to accept the price you are charging. That's exactly happened to China Evergrande today. I mean, China Evergrande, on paper, it's sitting on 3.2 trillion yuan assets. So which means it still has billions of assets more than its debt. But the problem is no one is going to accept these kind of prices. You look at the head office in Hong Kong, they are trying to sell it to another state-owned property kind of conglomerate. But, if it asks a very high price, the other side, the counterpart, are not willing to pay that much because they know that you are in trouble and we are the only potential buyer, so why should I pay the premium for the price? And it's happened like on thousands or even like tens of thousands of these projects in a small city. There's a China Evergrande project. And, you try to sell it to say it's worth 3 million. But the investors will not accept it. Maybe the fair value should be only 1 million. So if you calculate that, then China Evergrande is in deep trouble because all these assets, A, it's hard to sell. B, even if it can sell, the money raised cannot be enough to cover the debts.
So you mentioned how Evergrande has exhausted all channels to borrow money in China and also overseas channels. What does this tell us about the boss of Evergrande, Xi Jinping, or in English, Hui Ka-yan, about his political connections in China and not just with the elite, also with local governments?
Well, Mimi, I think this person has 2 names already speak a lot. Like his Chinese name is Xi Jinping, and he's coming from Henan. And, he has, in some public occasions, he mentioned like how poor his family was when he was back in Henan. He lost his mother at a very young age. Then he started his career as a worker in a steel factory, and a pretty hard job. But in 1992, after Deng Xiaoping said we have to embrace market economy, so this ambitious young man in a little rural town in Henan decided to try his luck, and he moved to Guangzhou, and which is the most promising economic land of China. And then he started to make his fortune in his property empire. And the name of Hui Ka-yan is actually the Cantonese name because he has such deep relations or close relations, rubbing the shoulders with Hong Kong property tycoons. Also, if you pay attention, he is actually a Hong Kong permanent resident, I think. He is one of these members in the election committee because he is a CPPCC member. So automatically he is one of those elites. We can see that he is certainly well-connected. In the South, he is among the Hong Kong property tycoons, playing cards with them, playing yacht with them, having these private jets and the decadent lifestyle. And on the other hand, he was a guest at the Great Hall of the People, even in the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, he was one of the very few Chinese private business owners that actually showed up in Tiananmen. Of course, he took the chance to spread the picture as well. So you can see this person is extraordinary in building up relations and managing all these different kind of stakeholders. And even look at him, like he has trying to set up China's most powerful soccer team. He is venturing into mineral water. I mean, he's doing lots of diversification. So it's quite interesting, to say, he, at the end of the day, is also a product by China's raw development area from early 1990s to today. People are rewarded by their ambitions. People are rewarded by their risk-taking. They continue to push the end of the envelope to exhaust all the resources they could possibly have and to build up their personal wealth empire.
Xi Jinping or Hui Ka-yan also have a third name, Zhou Xin, which is the brother belt. He's a symbol of capitalistic excess at a time when President Xi Jinping is trying to introduce the Common Prosperity campaign. So what a timing it is for Evergrande to run into a crisis like this.
Mimi, that's absolutely right. The Belt brothers coming from the famous picture in front of the Great Hall of the People. And one time he was attending this big conference and reporters tried to doorstep him asking some questions. And so he just ran away and in a very, very strange kind of expression. And of course, the most eye-catching on that picture is the Hermes belt with a symbol of luxury and extravagant lifestyle. And certainly he is. I mean, he has lots of gossips about how luxurious his personal lifestyle is. For instance, in his latest leaked hotel accommodation list, saying, he doesn't want any male approaching him apart from his bodyguards and a butler, personal butler. And then he never willing to spend 5 seconds to waiting for the lift, so they have the back office operating the lift. So when the moment he approaches the lift, the door will ding, will open, so he don't have to wait. And also he prefers in his room, like imported Japanese fruits, he certainly has high standards for this kind of food. And when he sleeps, every sign of light has to be covered, so with black cloths, because he cannot withstand these kind of distractions. So yes, it's he to some extent represent a whole kind of new China nouvelle riche, the kind of social class. They coming from a very humble backgrounds. And for reasons unknown, they become incredibly rich. And then they don't hesitate to show off their wealth. And maybe 10 years ago, that's absolutely fine, if they like luxurious goods. And sometimes they can even be a pioneer in lifestyle, which bottled water is better or which handbag is in fashion. But in these days, when Beijing is highlighting the concept of a common prosperity, all these things are becoming, unacceptable, basically, or at least like morally, it's
triggering.
Yes, it's questionable, and it's an issue. They have to do something, and then at this moment you borrowed so much money, as I just said, nearly 3% of China's GDP to finance your extravagant personal lifestyle. This is totally unacceptable. This is a message, I think, not only for Hui Ka-yan himself, but also for the whole new rich of the Chinese society. And this is not the end. This is the beginning of an end, I guess. The crackdown will just continue on these extravagance.
So, Zhou Xin, what is the end game for Evergrande?
Well, Mimi, let's go back to your first question. Will this be a Lehman Brothers? And my take is that it will not be, because China has this kind of experience in dealing with hugely indebted private conglomerates. We just look at H&A Group, which has huge, almost a similar problem as China Evergrande. When at its heyday, we still remember H&A came to Hong Kong and then say, getting to the land auction saying, I will just pay 50% above the highest price on the table, so no one going to bid with me. So this is a way. But now you look at H&A, all these ownerships are being wiped out. So it's completely a new company now. And then there are some haircuts, there are some write-offs, and there are new investors, of course. And for China Evergrande, I guess a similar model will be taken. Some people, especially the U.S. bond investors, I think they will have to face very deep haircuts. And for these tens of thousands of Chinese homeowners who actually pay the money to China Evergrande, I think the local governments and the central governments may find some way to help them at least get some money back or get the flats that are supposed to be theirs. And for suppliers, for private suppliers, they could have been bailed out by the government money because they are small and it matters to livelihood of the people. But for big state-owned suppliers, for instance, like huge construction companies, and maybe they have to take some losses because everyone has to, in this game, has to shoulder their own responsibilities. And that's the principle. So it's not going to, bring down the whole Chinese economy tomorrow, or it's going to be the meltdown of the Chinese banking system. But this process will be painful in the long term.
But what we concern the most is how are these housing projects that have been built are going to be paid for and finished? That would be something we worry the most, right?
Well, this is actually by case. I think for China Evergrande, they make very clear their priority is to make sure that all these unfinished construction projects can be finished, so that the houses can be given to the home buyers, or even to use these finished projects to get rollover from the banks. In very extreme situations, for instance, like in a city, the China Evergrande project cannot be finished, and there will be thousands of households trying to demanding their money. And that's not even new in China. These kind of stories happen again and again. So if it's just a one individual case, I think that's totally, manageable for the local governments or for the banking system. But for most of for instance, if the project is in Shenzhen, I don't think they have to worry too much about it.
But most of them are tied to second to third tier cities.
Yeah, it will be like handled by the city authority, the home buyers, and the local banks. If the past experiences can be a reference. For China, it's always like all the stakeholders sitting together, and there will be someone from the government and try to balance to share the losses, let's say.
And stability always comes first.
Yes, of course.
So, Zhou Xin, this is all inside China, but you also talked about foreign investors in China, getting a bear haircut. What if I tell you I got a really bad haircut and that cost me US $20 billion, and I'm never going to go back to it? So what does it mean for foreign investors who have exposed to Evergrande?
Well, it's certainly a bad lesson for some of these investors. I mean, for the specific case, of course, there will be losses, but you have to look at the bigger picture. I mean, for the foreign investors, they have been in China for the last 40 years, and maybe this of course, this is a huge loss. You can write it off. It's hard to swallow, but that's a reality, and then they can make money in other projects. That's how it worked in the last 20 or 30 years. For instance, the biggest exposed banks, BlackRock, HSBC, all having lots of exposure to Chinese market, not only China Evergrande. So if one batch of US dollar bonds get us out, and not every dollar can be taken back, they can always cover the losses from other more profitable investments. But yes, it is an interesting question, because maybe after China Evergrande, there will be more risk assessment about investing into Chinese, especially bonds issued by Chinese private enterprises. So they will demand kind of higher interest rate, higher coupon rate to justify the higher risks, which means Chinese companies may find it at least temporary, more difficult to raise money from the dollar market.
Zhou Xin, so this is noon Thursday that we are talking right now. What is the next timeline for Evergrande?
Well, that's really hard to say, because it's now kind of unexpected things. So any day, any moment can be a new announcement from China Evergrande. And more importantly, people are really waiting for the Chinese government to giving any signals, like how deep Chinese government wants to get involved. And so far, I don't think there's a clear answer or clear plan. That's why all the Chinese official media are almost keeping completely quiet or silent. The only thing we can see from the state media is saying, this is not going to be a huge problem. This is not going to bring down the whole Chinese economy. And that's possibly true. And on the other hand, it's also trying to manage the expectations a little bit. So this is going to be a long-term process. So we are just seeing the beginning, and no one is going to know how it will end. But no matter how it will end, it will be very, very interesting, I can guarantee you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting interview you shared with us. And we look forward to bringing you back to tell us more about this intriguing story.
Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you. That's all we have for you on the ongoing Evergrande crisis. Well, I know at the start of this podcast, I promised we would have a better idea of what might happen next. This is as much as we know right now, and it's late in the day here in Hong Kong, and I can tell you the journalists on the business desk are making coffee because it is going to be a long night for them. They'll be following the latest updates on the Evergrande story as they happen to SCMP.com, and you will see them posted on Twitter at SCMP News or on the South China Morning Post Facebook page. Thank you for listening. My name is Mimi Lau. See you next time.
Looking for a new podcast to listen to? Here's what we love, courtesy of Acast Recommends.
Hi, Hi, I'm Simon Jane, content creator, DJ, writer, now turned podcast host. I'm here with my friend, Donovan Bailey, 5-time world champion and Olympic world record holder turned savvy business mogul.
Running Things with me, Donovan Bailey, is an open-minded discussion about global topics relevant to the modern human experience.
Each episode is intended to offer enriching dialogue that leaves listeners with a deeper understanding of our topics.
And hopefully a refreshing new perspective as well.
You can find new episodes of Running Things every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts.
Running Things with Donovan Bailey.
Acast recommends.